Why so few Americans live in this huge area of the West Coast? Pull up a map of the West Coast and trace your finger from San Diego all the way up to Seattle. For most of that line, you're tracing sprawl. Suburbs bleeding into suburbs, freeway interchanges, and in and out at nearly every exit. Then, somewhere around the California-Oregon border, the dots on the map just stop. For roughly 200 miles, you can drive for an hour on the interstate and pass more deer than driveways. Cell service drops out in the canyons. The nearest hospital might be over an hour away. And this isn't some forgotten stretch of desert nobody wants. It might be one of the single most jaw-droppingly beautiful regions in all of North America. Here's the puzzle. California alone is home to nearly 40 million people. Oregon and Washington add millions more on top of that, almost all of it packed into a handful of metro areas. And right between two of the most fought-over, most expensive housing markets in the entire country sits a stretch of mountains, rivers, and ancient forest, roughly the size of several New England states combined. And almost nobody lives there. Today we're digging into exactly why, and the answer turns out to be a tangle of volcanic geology, brutal railroad engineering, indigenous wars, a vanished timber economy, a hidden cannabis economy, looming earthquake risk, and a defiant secessionist movement that still won't die. Let's get into it. But before we explain the why, let's get oriented on the where. The region we're talking about stretches from roughly the Sacramento Valley in Northern California, up through the Rogue Valley in Southern Oregon. On the coast, it's marked by small towns like Crescent City, Brookings, and Gold Beach. Inland, it's anchored by Eureka, Mount Shasta City, Weed, and Grants Pass, fading out toward the high desert edges of the Great Basin to the east. This isn't empty in the way the middle of Nevada is empty, with flat nothing stretching to the horizon in every direction. This is empty in a much stranger way, a landscape absolutely loaded with rivers, redwoods, volcanic peaks, and rugged coastline, sitting almost unoccupied because the terrain itself simply refuses to cooperate with the basic requirements of a city. Flat buildable land, easy transportation routes, and a reliable food and water supply that doesn't require flattening a mountain range to access it. To understand why this place stayed so empty, you have to go back further than any human history. You have to go back to the rocks themselves. Most of the famous mountains on the West Coast, the Cascades, the Sierra Nevada, are relatively young volcanic ranges in geologic terms. But the Klamath Mountains, which dominate this region, are something else entirely. They're a chaotic jumble of ancient oceanic crust, island arc fragments, and seafloor sediment that got scraped onto the edge of North America over roughly 200 million years, long before the Cascades to the east had even started erupting. That tangled, violent geologic past left behind a landscape with almost no flat ground anywhere. Just ridge after ridge of folded, faulted rock running in every direction, carved by deep, narrow river canyons. Layered right on top of that ancient mess is a much younger and far more explosive story: the Southern Cascade Volcanic Arc. Mount Shasta alone rises to 14,179 feet, one of the most massive stratovolcanoes in the lower 48. And the U.S. Geological Survey still classifies it as a very high threat for future eruption. Not far away in the mountains of southern Oregon, an even more consequential eruption shaped the land roughly 7,700 years ago, when Mount Mazama violently collapsed in on itself, leaving behind a caldera that filled with rain and snowmelt to become Crater Lake, the deepest lake in the United States. I know, stack those two mountain-building stories on top of each other, and you get a region where there's simply nowhere obvious to put a city. No wide river valley like Oregon's Willamette, no natural deep water harbor like San Francisco Bay or Puget Sound, just steep, folded terrain in every direction, broken up by rivers too small and too violent to function as real shipping lanes. Long before any wagon train or railroad surveyor showed up, this rugged country was very much inhabited, just not in the way that produces the kind of dense settlement we associate with cities. For thousands of years, peoples like the Karuk, Yurok, Shasta, Takelma, Modoc, and Klamath built entire ways of life around this exact terrain. Villages strung along the salmon-rich Klamath and Rogue rivers, acorn and camas harvesting in the foothills, seasonal movement between the coast and the high country. Population densities were naturally low because the land itself could only support so many people without modern agriculture, But these were not empty places. They were precisely tuned to a landscape that outsiders would later find nearly impossible to settle on European terms. The first documented overland crossing by non-native explorers came in 1828, when fur trapper Jedediah Smith led a party south along the coast through what's now Del Norte and Humboldt County territory. It did not go well. After a violent encounter near the mouth of the Smith River, Smith lost the majority of his men and barely escaped with his life. An early and brutal preview of just how unforgiving this stretch of coastline could be for anyone trying to move through it. Fast forward to the early 1800s, and the United States was still confined almost entirely to the eastern half of the continent. That changed fast after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 added 828,000 square miles to the country overnight, kicking off an era of westward expansion fueled by explorers like Lewis and Clark, and the steady drumbeat of settlers chasing fertile land. Most of that westward traffic flowed in one of two directions, and neither of them ran through the empty stretch we're talking about today. To the north, settlers followed the Oregon Trail, a punishing 2,000-mile wagon road from Missouri, straight into Oregon's Willamette Valley. That valley owed its incredible fertility to a bizarre prehistoric event called the Missoula Floods, in which a massive glacial ice dam repeatedly burst and reformed, sending walls of water across eastern Washington and depositing layer after layer of rich sediment into the valley below. Combined with the mighty Columbia River for shipping, the Willamette became one of the most desirable farming destinations in the entire West. Between 1841 and 1869, more than 400,000 settlers used the Oregon Trail to reach it. To the south, the California Gold Rush of 1848 detonated almost overnight, pulling an estimated 300,000 people into Northern California within just a few years. San Francisco exploded from a sleepy settlement of about 200 residents in 1846 into a booming city of 36,000 by 1852, anchored permanently by its deep water harbor. There was also a third option for crossing into this region: the Applegate Trail, a southern alternate route blazed in 1846, specifically to bypass the more dangerous stretches of the Columbia River route into Oregon. It cut directly through the heart of the rugged borderland we're focused on today. The irony is brutal, and it earned a reputation almost immediately as one of the harshest, most waterless, and most punishing alternate routes of the entire westward migration, complete with brutal desert crossings and grueling mountain passes. Most pioneers who survived it once never recommended it to anyone else, and most subsequent traffic avoided it in favor of the original Oregon Trail. So you had a fertile valley pulling people north, a gold rush harbor city pulling people south, and in between, a corridor so difficult that the one wagon route built specifically to go through it became infamous for nearly killing the people who used it. As if punishing terrain weren't enough to discourage settlement, the 1850s brought a different kind of chaos to this exact stretch of borderland. Sustained, violent conflict between native peoples and incoming miners and settlers. When gold turned up in the Rogue River Valley and along the Klamath River, prospectors poured in with little regard for the people already living there. Tensions exploded into what's now remembered as the Rogue River Wars, a series of escalating skirmishes and full battles, fought from 1851 through 1856 between Oregon militia volunteers and a loose confederacy of tribes, including the Takelma, Shasta, and Tututni. Entire villages were burned. A leader known as Tecumtum, or Chief John, organized hundreds of warriors in a last desperate campaign through the Siskiyou Mountains, before finally being forced to surrender. Almost simultaneously, similar violence broke out to the south along the Klamath River itself, a conflict historians call the Klamath River War, pitting miners against the Karuk and Yurok. Both conflicts ended the same way: forced removal. Surviving tribal members were marched off to reservations like Table Rock, and later Grand Ronde and Siletz, hundreds of miles from their home territory. It's a dark and important piece of the puzzle, right? For a solid 5 years in the middle of the century, this exact region wasn't just hard to reach because of its mountains. It was actively dangerous, which did nothing to encourage the kind of stable, family-based settlement that builds towns and cities over time. Gold mining did bring a temporary surge of people into the region itself. Towns like Eureka and Jacksonville exploded almost overnight in the early 1850s as prospectors chased deposits hidden throughout the Klamath Mountains. But unlike San Francisco, these mining camps had no deep water harbor and no large agricultural valley to fall back on once the easy gold ran out. Many shrank dramatically once the rush passed, and a number of smaller camps disappeared from the map entirely, leaving nothing behind but a name on an old survey and maybe a cemetery. Here's where the story takes a genuinely fascinating turn, because this region wasn't simply overlooked by the infrastructure of a growing nation. It was actively engineered around more than once for very specific reasons. When the Southern Pacific Railroad built its original main line connecting California and Oregon in the 1880s, engineers had no real alternative but to send it directly over Siskiyou Pass, climbing to a summit above 4,000 feet on grades as steep as 3.5%, among the steepest stretches on any major rail line in the entire country. Locomotives needed extra helper engines just to drag trains up and over the pass, and the trip between Eugene, Oregon, and the town of Dunsmuir, California, could take the better part of a full day. By the 1920s, Southern Pacific had had enough. The company built an entirely new route further inland through the gentler grades around Klamath Falls and Willamette Pass, officially opening it in 1926. Almost overnight, the original Siskiyou line went from being the primary connector between two growing states to a secondary branch that serious freight and passenger traffic simply avoided. As if to put an exclamation point on just how lawless and remote that stretch of track had become, it was the site of the so-called Last Great Train Robbery in 1923, when three brothers held up a Southern Pacific passenger train at the mouth of a tunnel directly beneath the pass, killing 4 crew members in the process. Decades later, when federal engineers were planning the route for Interstate 5 in the 1950s, they seriously proposed the exact same kind of detour around the difficult terrain. Only this time, political pressure from the cities of Medford and Roseburg, which didn't want to be bypassed, won out. I-5 stayed on the harder route, climbing the original Siskiyou summit at a 6% grade that remains, to this day, one of the most notorious stretches of winter highway driving on the entire West Coast, infamous among long-haul truckers for chain requirements, jackknifed rigs, and sudden whiteout snow squalls. So, depending on which form of transportation you're talking about, this region either got bypassed entirely or got stuck with the leftover hard route nobody else wanted. Either way, the message from a century and a half of infrastructure planning has been remarkably consistent. Build around this place if you possibly can. It's worth pausing here to look at just how empty this area actually is today, because the statistics are almost hard to believe for a region this close to major cities on both sides. Take Siskiyou County in far northern California. It covers more than 6,000 square miles of land, bigger than the entire state of Connecticut, and is home to roughly 42,000 people. Do the math and you land on a population density of around 7 people per square mile, putting it in roughly the same range as Wyoming, one of the least densely populated states in the entire country, despite Siskiyou sitting only a few hours' drive from millions of Bay Area residents. For broader comparison, the United States overall averages closer to 90 people per square mile, and California as a whole averages well over 200. Cross the state line into Oregon and look at Curry County, hugging the rugged southern coast. About 22,000 people spread across 1,600 square miles of land, working out to roughly 14 people per square mile, and that population has actually been shrinking in recent years rather than growing. Both counties fall into a category demographers sometimes call frontier counties, places sparse enough to functionally resemble the unsettled frontier of the 19th century, just with paved roads and Wi-Fi that cuts out the moment a storm rolls in. And these two counties aren't outliers. Trinity County, Modoc County, Del Norte County, Josephine County. The list of nearly empty counties strung along this exact seam between California and Oregon goes on and on. As for actual cities, the largest population center in this whole stretch is the Eugene, Oregon metro area, with roughly 380,000 people sitting at the far southern tip of the Willamette Valley, a fraction of Portland's size, just a couple hours north. After that comes the Medford metro area at around 220,000, then Chico, California at roughly 210,000. Bend, Oregon, and Redding, California round things out as the only other mid-sized population centers, each sitting somewhere in the 90 to 100,000 range. Notably, Bend has consistently ranked among the fastest growing small cities in the entire country over the past decade. Proof that when this region does manage to produce a town with decent infrastructure, people absolutely want to live there. Here's the twist in all of this, though. The same chaotic geology that kept people out also built one of the most biologically remarkable landscapes on the entire continent. Because the Klamath Mountains largely escaped the heavy glaciation that scoured much of the rest of North America during the last ice age, and because their tangled geologic history produced an unusual patchwork of soils, including rare, mineral-heavy serpentine soils that are actually toxic to many ordinary plants. The region became a refuge where ancient plant lineages survived long after disappearing everywhere else. Botanists now recognize the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion as a globally significant biodiversity hotspot, home to an estimated 3,500 plant species, with more than 280 found absolutely nowhere else on Earth. It supports more native conifer species than any other temperate forest region in North America, and the International Union for Conservation of Nature has formally designated it an area of global botanical significance, one of only a handful on the entire continent. In other words, the very isolation that kept this place off the population map is exactly what allowed it to stay wild enough to become one of the most ecologically important landscapes in the country. Emptiness here wasn't a failure of the land. It was almost the entire point. For much of the 20th century, logging was the one industry that did manage to put real, sustained paychecks into this region's small towns. Old-growth forest covered tens of millions of acres across Oregon, Washington, and Northern California through the mid-1900s, and the timber industry built entire communities around sawmills and logging crews. Then, in 1990, the northern spotted owl was listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act, triggering the designation of nearly 7 million acres of critical habitat with strict logging restrictions. The impact was immediate and brutal. Timber harvest volumes from federal forests in the region collapsed by roughly 87% between 1988 and 1996, and tens of thousands of timber-related jobs disappeared across Oregon, Washington, and Northern California over the following decade. Whole towns that had built their identity around the mill suddenly had no mill. Some communities pivoted toward tourism or remote work in the years since, but many never fully replaced the steady, well-paying jobs the timber industry used to provide. Now, which has made the region even less attractive to new working-age residents looking to put down roots. When the legitimate timber economy collapsed, a very different industry quietly stepped in to fill part of the gap. One that thrived precisely because this region was so hard to reach and so hard to police. Humboldt, Trinity, and Mendocino counties, just south of the Klamath-Siskiyou core, became known collectively as the Emerald Triangle, the largest cannabis-growing region in the United States, supplying an outsized share of the entire country's marijuana, since back-to-the-land growers first settled the hills in the 1960s and 70s. The same isolated canyons and dense tree cover that kept the railroad and the highway department away made these mountains close to perfect for a crop that, for decades, needed to stay hidden from federal authorities. At its peak, Mendocino County alone was generating something like $1 billion a year from cannabis, representing the majority of its entire local economy. But isolation that helps you hide a crop doesn't help you sell it once the rules change. After California legalized recreational cannabis in 2016, small growers found themselves competing against large, well-funded operations in flatter, more accessible parts of the state, and prices crashed. Towns that had quietly run on cannabis money for 2 generations suddenly found that economy buckling too. On top of the timber economy that had already collapsed decades earlier. It's a pattern worth sitting with. This region keeps generating real economic activity, just never the kind of stable, broadly distributed activity that grows a population over the long run. On top of the economic hit, this exact landscape has become one of the most fire-prone in the entire country in recent decades. The same dense, fuel-loaded forests that make the Klamath-Siskiyou region so biologically rich also burn explosively once a fire gets going, and the area's tangled topography makes those fires brutally difficult to fight. In the summer of 2022, The McKinney Fire tore through more than 90 square miles of the Klamath National Forest in a matter of days, burning so intensely that subsequent rainstorms washed ash and sediment into the Klamath River and triggered a massive fish kill stretching dozens of miles downstream. Lightning-sparked fires routinely ignite dozens of blazes across the region in a single summer thunderstorm event. For anyone weighing whether to move to this part of the country, that's one more variable stacked against the calculation. Rising insurance costs, smoke-choked summers, and evacuation risk on top of an already difficult, isolated landscape. And fire isn't even the only natural hazard hanging over this stretch of coastline. Running offshore for roughly 700 miles, from Cape Mendocino in Northern California up through Oregon and Washington to Vancouver Island, lies the Cascadia Subduction Zone, a fault capable of producing one of the most powerful earthquakes on the planet. Scientists estimate the southern end of the fault, the segment sitting directly off the coast of this exact region, has somewhere between a 30 and 40% chance of producing a major magnitude 8 earthquake within the next 50 years, with shaking that could last 4 to 6 minutes and trigger a tsunami dozens of feet high along towns like Crescent City, Gold Beach, and Brookings. The last full margin rupture of the entire fault happened in the year 1700, an event so massive it sent a tsunami all the way across the Pacific to Japan, where it was recorded in historical records as an orphan tsunami, with no warning earthquake felt nearby. For coastal communities already isolated by geography, that kind of risk adds yet another reason for insurers, planners, and prospective residents to think twice. Stacking seismic hazard on top of wildfire risk on top of brutal terrain on top of a collapsed timber economy. Given just how cut off this region has always felt from the population centers governing it, it's not surprising that, at various points, residents have floated a genuinely radical solution. Stop being part of California or Oregon altogether. Back in the early 1940s, frustrated by what felt like total neglect from state capitals hundreds of miles away, residents on both sides of the border began organizing around the idea of a brand new 51st state, naming it Jefferson after the founding father associated with rural self-sufficiency and agrarian independence. The movement got far enough along to stage a mock gubernatorial inauguration and design an official flag. 2 gold X's on a green and gold field, symbolizing the double cross felt by a region ignored by both Sacramento and Salem. The outbreak of World War II effectively shelved the entire idea before it could go any further, but it never fully disappeared. In recent years, frustration over land use regulation, taxation, and a persistent sense that rural voices simply don't carry weight in state houses dominated by coastal cities has brought the State of Jefferson movement roaring back, especially across several counties on the California side of the line that have since passed symbolic resolutions in support of secession. The legal odds remain almost impossibly long. Creating a new state requires sign-off from the existing state legislature and from Congress itself. And not everyone within the region even wants it. But the persistence of the idea says something real about how disconnected this place still feels from the urban cores that technically govern it. Here's where I want to step outside the history and geology for a second and give you my honest take. I believe this huge stretch of the West Coast proves that not every desirable place is meant for massive populations. Sometimes the most breathtaking places are the hardest to live in. We tend to assume that if a landscape is gorgeous, eventually a city will rise up to claim it, that beauty and population growth go hand in hand. But this region is living proof that the two can pull in completely opposite directions. The same ruggedness that makes Crater Lake, Mount Shasta, and the Klamath River canyons so spectacular to look at is the same ruggedness that makes them brutally impractical to build a city around. And honestly, I think that's worth celebrating rather than fixing. Not every spectacular place needs a skyline. Some of them are better left exactly as wild and half-empty as they've always been. So the next time you're driving I-5 between the Bay Area and Portland, and you hit that long, quiet stretch where the towns thin out and the forest closes in around you, you'll know exactly why it's there. It isn't neglect, and it isn't an accident of history. It's 200 million years of geology, a century and a half of railroads and highways routing around the hard parts, a vanished timber economy and the shadow economy that briefly replaced it, an earthquake fault biding its time offshore, and a landscape that fights back with fire every summer. all quietly working together to preserve one of the wildest, strangest, and most biologically rich corners of the entire West Coast. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what place we should cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.